Hello. I've wanted to do this for a while and I've finally gotten around to it. Bear with me as this is my first video. I'm going to read from Tales of Mr. Pengachoosa by Carolyn Rush. The first story is called The Snow House. It all started one winter after I had rheumatic fever, and I was told that I must stay indoors during extra bad weather. Somehow that winter the weather seemed to be nearly always extra bad, and I had seemed to spend so much time looking into the rainy garden or watching the other children playing that my father brought me home a hamster as a pet to keep me company. And that was really how it all began. I called him Hammy. And though he did not like being stroked, he loved to sit quietly in my cupped hands and wash himself. One day in early December, when my sisters had gone to a Christmas party, and the house was very quiet, we sat together by the fire, and I seemed to notice that among his squeaks there were some that almost sounded like words. I was amazed, and I found that when I listened very closely I could catch one or two words, and even whole sentences. He seemed to be talking about someone called Mr. Pengachoosa, and as I listened more and more carefully, I began to understand that Mr. Pengachoosa had been his grandfather. Hammy talked so softly and quickly that it was almost as if it came from my own head. And just as I was beginning to understand nearly every word, my sisters came home. They banged the front door and started running upstairs laughing, and Hammy stopped talking altogether when they burst into the room. I told them what had happened, but they did not even try to believe me. And when they had gone out again, even though I listened very carefully, I could not hear a word, so I hardly believed it myself. One day, about a week later, when we were sitting on the window seat watching the snow falling outside, very softly, he began to tell me about his grandfather, and this time I understood. It was about Mr. Pengachoosa and the big snowstorm. Mr. Pengachoosa had been staying with friends in the country. It had been snowing for days, but on this morning it was different, clear and sunny, and Mr. Pengachoosa decided to go for a walk. At first it was lovely, and he had walked quite a long way from the house when it started to snow again. Great white flakes tumbled down, and Mr. Pengachoosa soon found that they had covered up his footsteps behind him, and he could not see his way back. So round and round he wandered, getting snowier every minute, until he saw ahead of him in the snow a little house. But when he went up to ask the way, he found that it was a rather strange little house, for it had no doors, just windows, and they were all open with the snow blowing in. And as he drew nearer, he found it was hardly a house at all, just one little room with windows all around, but it looked dry, so he climbed in. Inside it was warm and still, which was surprising, for on the floor there were piles of snow that had blown in, and when he had grown used to the dim light, he saw, hanging up in front of him on the wall, there was a sign. It said, "You may choose any picture." At first he could not see any pictures. Then he noticed them stacked up against the walls. There were paintings of all shapes and sizes, so Mr. Pengachoosa went up to one of them to have a closer look. It was a painting of cows in a meadow, and as he looked at it, he found that he could smell very faintly the scent of meadow grass and clover. And when he put his ear to it, he could hear the faint off sound of mooing cows. The next picture was of boats in a harbor, and at this one he caught the slight smell of seaweed, and heard the distant crying of gulls. And so he went around examining each picture, and trying to make up his mind which to choose, until at last he came to one, a little one, standing alone, that he liked best. It was just a picture of a little girl standing in the snow and smiling, and on her hands she had a little white muff, and on her head a soft white hat. She had such a friendly face, and seemed to be smiling so particularly for Mr. Pengachoosa that he decided to choose her. As he picked up the picture, he noticed what he had thought was snow beside the painting was really a pile of soft white feathers, and when he picked them up, he found that they were a muff and hood, just like the ones the little girl wore in the picture. So he put them under his jacket with the painting, and had one more look around, and climbed out of the window. The snow had stopped, and he found his way home quickly. It was the next day, when he set out to find the little house again, that he became surprised. For though he trotted up and down the hills around the woods, he could not find it. All the next day he searched, and the next, and all the while the snow was melting. Soon it became too slippery for walking far. So it was not until the last day, when the snow had quite gone, that he found the little house again. And when he saw it, he understood why it had no doors. For in front of him was a tall tower, right on top of his little house. When he had come first, the snow had been so deep that it had almost covered the tower. And what he had thought was a little house was really the top room of the tower sticking out above the snow. So he never did manage to get into the little picture room again, and the next day he left for... My hamster stopped suddenly and ran into his nest box, for someone below had begun banging the gong loudly for tea. "Please don't stop now," I said. "Didn't he ever manage to get back?" "Never enough snow," said my hamster shortly. "Now run along, because I need my sleep and you need your tea." "But please, tell me what happened to the muff and hood." "They melted," he said sleepily, "when the snow went." "And the picture of the little girl?" But his eyes were shutting. "Don't you notice anything?" he said. "Look in the hall near the front door." And his eyes were tight shut. As I went down to tea, I looked, and behind the door in the hall was a picture that I had never really looked at before, of a little girl with a muff and hood, standing in the snow and smiling. I'm not sure if you could actually really see that, but the next story that I'll read will be The Mermaid. Thanks.